Hey everybody, welcome to Cracking the Comms Code. I'm Dustin Siggins with Proven Media Solutions. And with me are Jennifer, Brad, and Jeremy to talk about how to make sure that your CEO and the broad C-suite are building the brand and not creating a crisis. Jennifer, Jeremy, and Brad, if you could introduce yourselves, we'll kick things off.
Great. Hey, thanks for having us, Dustin. This is such an important conversation today, and I look forward to just diving into it with my colleagues, Brad and Jeremy here. So I am Jennifer Bowcock. I've spent most of my career, all of my career, in communications and public relations, working for big brands such as AT&T and Apple and Dolby, but then also market leaders by categories, such as RealPage and ChargePoint. And I say all of this because we're going to talk today about like how much just words matter, right? Spokespeople choosing wisely, all these things matter, and they actually have a direct impact based on the brands that you are working for and representing. So I look forward to the conversation.
Who's next?
Brad or Jeremy, it's a 50-50 shot. I don't care who.
You go, Brad.
Okay, I'll go. Brad Gorman. So nice to see everyone joining. And Dustin, thank you for having us. Jennifer and Jeremy, looking forward to a really great discussion. So I've spent most of my career working at the intersection of business, government, and the public good for big brands like Whirlpool, KitchenAid, and mostly recently with GM. At GM, I was in charge of their technology transformation, going all EV and AV, so a big transformation happening with that company. And most recently, I've been operating independently under Gorman Strategies, doing fractional communication leadership for different companies. And since CEO communications came up, I was looking through my history, and I had the fun fact that I've written for 8 CEOs and 1 president in my time working in communications.
Well, I can't top those statistics, but my name is Jeremy Tunis. I'm also, for most of the last decade, I've served as a fractional advisor on public affairs, reputation, policy communication, leadership communication issues, primarily for companies in the healthcare industry that can range from trade associations to hospital and healthcare companies, med tech startups, pharmaceutical, life sciences companies, and the like. Prior to being a fractional advisor, I've spent time in-house at companies like Amazon and large PR firms like Burson Marsteller, now Burson, and Edelman. And really happy to be here with you, Dustin, a good friend and thought partner, and looking forward to talking to Jennifer and Brad, 2 people I've respected for a long time. Thank you.
I'm putting a comment here below the post because in our prep call, we're going on different angles. There's been an email chain between everybody for the last week as we've been kind of prepping which angles to go with. And Brad came up with it. Jeremy had to jump for something. And right after he left, I think Brad was waiting for Jeremy to get off. He goes, you know what we're going to do? We're going to dial into the big bad CEO pain point. That's what we should dial into. And I thought that was a really good way to kick things off because, Jennifer, you talked about authenticity. You and Jeremy both talked about most answers are uncomfortable. It depends. We talk about internal, external comms, all these different things. But the biggest pain point is no one trusts CEOs, yet they want to feel connected to the brand. And if a CEO is the head of a company doing layoffs, Meta, or taking the commuter jet, Starbucks, this is what gets the headline because it's the big bad CEO. So Brad, let's start from there. What is the position of the C-suite, the CEO, in the eyes of consumers, regulators, investors, and other stakeholders?
Sure. So I like to think of the CEO from an opportunity perspective. Like you've got the CEO, who they are, what they care about, how authentic they are. And then you have the company or the brand. Wherever that overlap is, that's where you really want to position your CEO. And I feel like it's one of the toughest times that we've ever faced right now because of the big bad CEO narrative. The thing that made me think of that phrase was you talking about the Starbucks news. And I was looking into it between our prep call and now, and the CEO has delivered great earnings and great turnaround, but the CEO also makes 6,000 times the salary of their average barista with all of the compensation and benefits. So we as communicators are not going to solve this huge income inequality gap that we're facing. But what we can do is position CEOs authentically, transparently. We can tell stories about what the company is doing to support their employees, to support the communities where they operate. So I don't necessarily have a solution to the big bad CEO. I think it's a existential problem that America is facing. But I think what we can do to protect the CEO reputation and protect the company reputation is a really fascinating time right now.
Yeah, I would add to that, I'm going to channel some of the lawyers that I've worked with in the past. They love to say it depends. So I think you have to ask yourself as a communicator, should I use my CEO on this topic, right? If you are faced with layoffs, that may not require the CEO. It may require the chief people officer. It really depends on how authentic that CEO is. Do employees trust them? Do investors trust them to say, you're navigating and steering this correctly? If it's a new product launch, maybe the CEO doesn't need to lean in. Now, when I was at Apple, yes, the CEO was the face of new product launches, and that made sense, and that was part of the culture and the heritage. But in the case of a new product launch, and we saw this with McDonald's, right? That was classic a month ago. The CEO probably did not need to lean in to the launch of a new hamburger. By the sheer fact, he called it a product launch. So, but I think it's the choosing wisely, right? Then you can help start to avoid the big bad CEO narrative. That is such an easy headline and story and narrative for everybody to write.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. And I also think it's highly dependent on the brand and the persona and the themes that this CEO has built. Of course, hopefully with the help of people like the four of us here, but I think there's this for the CEOs where I think it works for him or her, you do see two kind of common threads that I think are important, and whether that has to do with layoff news, with acquisition news, with a crisis, right? Is the individual seen as authentic to sort of who they are, right? I mean, there's a lot of controversial CEOs, obviously we think about characters like Elon Musk is probably the one that comes to mind. I think, many of us might have, qualms with the way that Elon Musk communicates or goes about it. But I don't think there would be very many people who would say that they're one, surprised at what he says, or two, that he is somehow inauthentic. He sort of is who he is, right? And lets the chips fall where they may. And one of the reasons that I think it works for him, candidly, more often than it doesn't, is because he has the financial performance to go along with it, right? And there's a certain consistency in that, and that doesn't mean you can always get away with being a jerk or being weird, but the company's organizational performance can oftentimes overcome some communication challenges. I think, we see that also. I think about Alex Karp as another great example. He is definitely the CEO of Palantir, definitely an unorthodox CEO who says and does things that are maybe non-traditional, but when you look at a company that on its earnings calls consistently is, raising revenue guidance by 60, 70, 80%, he's given the benefit of the doubt.
That's right.
I think we saw that with Jamie Dimon. You brought him up on the prep call, Jeremy. I mean, it would be easy to argue that he created controversy, what, a year ago? Talking about RTO with that
Yep.
town hall he did.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a few blurb headlines, but as far as I could tell, I mean, within a day or two, I don't think anybody was surprised at what he said. He's
Yeah. In
known for being
fact,
a
I
brash
would,
good shooter.
yeah, I would argue the rant that leaked, the maybe the pessimists and some of us say that, he intended it to be leaked, but this rant about people being, prepared for meetings, this rant about people, being on their phones too much or not showing up in person to the office or being distracted or, one of the parts of that rant when he was cursing was about, not leaning into your direct reports, not mentoring
Mhm.
correctly, right? I think, yeah, it was certainly a brash and a little bit unhinged, but I think to your point, the negative parts of it, I think, kind of wore away because it was all sort of in line with signals and statements and aura that Jamie Dimon has projected, for decades, right? And it was, for lack of a better term, and Brad writes speeches for CEOs, it was heavily on brand for Jamie Dimon. Now, if, that same rant was leaked from a CEO who had this maybe touchy-feely, who had this very gentle or genteel sort of brand, and the person was sort of cursing and being brash, that might be more damaging because it could be seen as, contradictory or fake, or maybe showing that real person's true colors in not a good way, right? So I think that when we think about CEOs and company leaders, I think it's incumbent on communication counselors to really know the person, that person's style. We can't form, a CEO, in our own model, right? We have to work with the individuals. I mean, they're still flawed human beings, very successful and accomplished ones, but by and large, as adults, we sort of are who we are. Like my wife, for example, if she wanted a quiet, non-opinionated life partner, like she's not going to be able to do that right now.
No, it's a really good point because SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried, had this reputation of caring about people, and what came out was definitely not about that. Whereas Elon Musk, was considered liberal a decade ago. Now he's considered conservative, but along the way, everyone's kind of used to him being quirky. One of the things that obviously we talk about, I mentioned Starbucks earlier. Just because investors are happy and because customers are returning, doesn't necessarily mean that the headlines about him flying everywhere aren't important to internal communications. And I know I said this last week on the show. What I knew about internal comms growing up was my father inviting the roofing crew over, and my mom had a strict 3 beer limit when they were having their team meetings over pool. So I'll leave it up to the three of you to discuss internal comms on the basis of who should be talking about layoffs to internally, never mind externally. Who should be, should the CEO be worried when he's flying everywhere, or should that just be a straightforward, I have to travel because that's part of my job conversation with the team?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the sort of shareholder value and what that CEO is driving, because I think what most people don't realize is that a lot of executive communications when you're doing CEO comms is financial. It's delivering, investor days and investor decks and quotes to CNBC about financial performance. So I think that part is so critical that can bridge out to other areas, right? So if you're really working on building trust and reputation, it's not just how do I explain earnings and our investments and our profitability. It's how do I bridge that out to other audiences to show a broader picture of what we're doing for our employees, for our communities.
I think that's right. I mean, I look back to many, many years ago, the Business Roundtable's purpose of a corporation, right? And the different constituents and the different societal imperatives that a corporation. I mean, we look back like in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was like, a company's job was to return financial value to its investors. And anything beyond that,
Period.
Right.
yeah, period. Full stop, as the kids say, right? The purpose, and that was it. So how one treated their employees, employee safety,
Mhm.
employee retention, right?
Environmental impact, all that.
Right.
Environmental impact, social
Mhm.
impact, corporate social responsibility, and then as we moved on, diversity and inclusion, and um, uh, all the things that we think about. I would argue like government relations, policy making. I mean, these were all things that were only tied into the company's financial and giving back to the communities, right? And so I think we've we've had various sort of zeitgests and eras of this, and that's probably a topic for another day, right? But I do think the financial communications, I think, we're definitely in an era now where that's sort of come more to the forefront. But we know that reputation is tightly connected with brand value, right? To
Right.
these various constituents. I mean, we're thinking about, having the best employees, and, will some of them be replaced at some point with AI in most industries? Probably, right? But we think about, like, services businesses, right? Technology businesses. I mean, they are very tied to the quality of the people that work there. I mean, it's not just, you don't want to be a jerk to people when you lay them off, but there are longer term ramifications when you don't handle layoffs in the right way that do have a financial component, right? You have what that does to, for example, policymakers, right? Company CEOs can say things now that not only have always moved financial markets, but can move, political policy making in ways that may be deleterious to those companies, right? And obviously, we've seen, particularly like during the pandemic, what happens when local communities become angry at industries and companies and their leaders, right? I mean, we're seeing this
Yeah.
thing right now with data centers, right?
AI.
And it's not just, a Democrat issue, a Republican issue. So I think all these considerations have to come into what CEOs are both saying out loud and signaling, right? And I think, for us as communicators, we have to think about all these different constituent groups all at
Yeah.
once and how each one of these things can impact those different groups.
That's right. And at the root of this is really just developing a plan. And this sounds so basic, but part of our roles as communicators is to say, okay, when does the CEO speak, and what topic does he or she speak on, and where? Right? Is he or she on broadcast? Are they on social media? Are they going to be authentic if I throw them on X all of a sudden? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Or TikTok, or you name the platform. Um, so I think you start with a plan, you get alignment on it to say, in our C suite, if we just back up to the C suite, because it's maybe bigger than the CEO, and the C suite says the CPO is going to talk about this, head of innovation is going to talk about that, CEO is going to talk about this. And so I think getting alignment and then just sticking to your plan, right? And then that way, when a crisis potentially happens, call it layoffs, call it product recall, call it whatever it is, right? We can all come up with 10 of these. We somewhat have some directional alignment of who speaks, where they speak, and why they're speaking.
Yeah, and I think building on that with having the plan, knowing the business priorities and where to position those C-suite leaders beyond what they're initially thinking is important as well. Like one of the first leadership communications that I did in my communication career was we had the CEO of a Fortune 150 company testifying before the Department of Commerce about fair trade, which is really good for US manufacturing workers to have global fair trade so we can keep producing products in America. And we were thinking of it very myopically with the DC audience. And suddenly we realized we've got our CEO in Washington, DC talking about our workforce. So we brought in that, and it was so fun. I get to fly in the corporate jet with the CEO. And at the hearing, I got to live tweet his testimony. This was like 12 years ago. But I was like, oh, a little junior communicator in the back of the room live tweeting. And so we were able to amplify that story to be not just him testifying at the Department of Commerce. It was like stories about our 22,000 US manufacturing workers, his testimony about his time with the company and what it meant for the American workforce. It was like broadened into this, which was something that was already going on, but we were able to broaden the story. And then, of course, position him in op-eds in Politico. And it was just looking for those business moments and how we could tell that story in a broader way.
That's right. And you gave that story legs on platforms that potentially he was not even on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you added a little bit of control to the narrative, right, for that moment, besides just giving it legs, right? And his narrative is now showing up in other places with a little bit of control because Brad is behind it,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think go ahead, Jeremy. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I think like this also brings up, I mean, talking about like the planning and the signaling, and I think like the really successful, if you could say successful, or like moments are involve often pre-signaling, right? Like if you have, we look at an example, that got a lot of, I think, negative sentiment from the Oracle layoffs. Like, this is like 2 or 3 weeks ago. It was like a 6 a.m. local
Oh,
time email,
Yeah.
basically the due to local, requirements, this is your last day, and signed Oracle leadership, and your email and logins get cut off in 30 minutes, and here's this, phone number or website to click on to like get your proverbial affairs in order. Like, not great, right? Vague, inhumane, confusing, like all the words you and I don't really want to ever have associated with work we're doing, right? And then you sort of contrast that, and Jennifer George, who's CCO Dispatch, is required reading, I think, for folks
yes.
that do what we do every day, and
Yeah,
you can find
right.
it on LinkedIn. She raised this issue. You contrast that with the layoff announcement that Snap did. I mean, they laid off less people. It was like 1,000 people. It was like 15% of their workforce, something like that, right? Where instead of talking in sort of vague, confusing terms about like we're reducing force or we're exploring AI-enabled efficiencies across our business or we're right sizing for the AI revolution. Like cute wording doesn't really tell anyone. Like he explained in a letter that was put into an SEC filing that, 60% or something of the new code that's written at Snap for its Mount, company infrastructure is now generated by AI. And therefore, they didn't require that same structure of the company, right? So it was like still probably painful for the people involved, of course, right? But there was a data-driven explanation of the act, and the stock had a bump. It went up like 5 or 6% that day. And so I think like, but the other thing about him is that he had been talking about these issues outside of this layoff announcement several times over the course of a year or so. He talked about upcoming crucible moments. He had done speeches on, workforce changes that are going to be happening and what, growth on some types of jobs will occur and other jobs that may be replaced. So it was like he had established some credibility here and some humanity prior versus, others that either the CEO isn't involved because he or she hadn't really spoken on these topics or has done so in a vague
Yeah.
way. So I think the signaling and the build out of credibility on these topics like layoffs or product improvement needs to be an iterative thing over time, not sort of one off or two off.
And for one of the things you said in our prep call is that layoffs have been happening throughout all of history. And
Mhm.
you said something like, I'm not surprised, but they were talking about Meta's layoffs. And when I looked at the New York Post article that's on this conversation, this video, it was not the CEO who was quoted, but also buried in it was this. Again, I don't have a corporate background. My background has been in political nonprofits and running my own company. Um, so I thought it was a fairly extensive severance package. I think it was 16 weeks of pay, health insurance, and a bunch of other things. So the headline was layoffs. Oh my gosh, Meta. But really, Meta's been talking about AI, to Jeremy's point, for years. They've been talking about they're always making shifts to meet the marketplace where it is politically in the market, buying companies, etc. how much does it matter when they get these kinds of headlines? One, and two, there's always going to be the guy from Oracle who puts up a Reddit thing, and that's going to go viral anyway because no one trusts the CEO. How important are some of the things that Jeremy's talking about in the grand scheme of a company's life cycle?
Yeah, if we pick on layoffs, one of 10 things, right, that could be bubbling
Sure.
up uh, from a negative perspective, right? Layoffs
Yep.
have really become this predictable reality, unfortunately, right? The four of us could sit here and name, you know, many companies, right? We're talking about Meta here. We can also talk about Microsoft and Amazon and
Of
Oracle
course.
and
Right.
insert companies. So. Um, I think the things here that are important is as we look at the New York Post article, as we look at whatever the headlines are, we're analyzing the internal leak. We're analyzing the author of the internal leak. We're analyzing, okay, who was the second level spokesperson that then started to weigh in with the New York Post or with these other outlets. And so I keep coming back to asking the viral question here is from a meta comms perspective to your question is what did the plan look like, right? If we knew that layoffs were coming, what's the media matrix, the key message here? Are we blaming it on AI like everybody's doing today, unfortunately? Then who is actually going to serve in primary and secondary spokesperson roles? And then who are they going to deliver this message to? So I think the layers are a lot here, right? And I think it's defining what this plan is. Otherwise, if insert company, if the company says I only have one spokesperson the whole time, CEO, head of comms, you name the person, or I'm now going to start identifying 5 and 6 spokespeople, then you start getting your mixed messages out there. So I think there's a lot of different complexities to this. And unfortunately, those articles are focusing on just the layoffs. They weren't focusing on the predictions that came behind it. They weren't
Mhm.
focusing on, quite frankly, the generous packages that we believe
Right.
the impacted employees got. And they were just salacious headlines. We all know that they're written by a headline department to get better clicks. And so I think, you know, as communicators, you have to sit here and start figuring out how to manage that before and then certainly doing during and then certainly afterward, right?
Mhm.
I think I probably would have called the New York Post, right?
Right.
In that case, and had a discussion with them of like, you're actually missing a big piece of the story here, right? And maybe it's misrepresentative. Let me tell you something else on background, right? So I think some of this is we don't know what we don't know here in the case of Meta or that particular article, but it just comes back to just planning, right? Just knowing like what are we going to do when the thing happens because it's going to happen.
And I think too with the meta situation, it was not helpful to them given what happened like a year before, where they did another huge cut, and instead of kind of pointing towards, new priorities,
Mhm.
their
Right.
framing of those layoffs was essentially that these folks were dead weight, that
Mhm.
it was
Right.
layovers from COVID, and these were underperformers, and
Forgot about that. Oh my God.
yeah, and I think that it made a really negative mark, and it was done in the context. Not only did they sort of, I mean, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, say that these 16,000 people were underperformers or had been
Yeah.
doing a lot of remote work and hadn't really showed up, and they were dead weight, and one, the damage that that could potentially cause those thousands of people in the future careers. And it was continued to be communicated during a period where, Meta, Facebook was setting record earnings, profit margins, all of the things, right? So, and, Mark Zuckerberg is, expanding his property holdings in Hawaii. And, his net worth is as high as it's ever been. So there was a lot of externalities that were unfavorable. And so while I think the coverage was salacious and in some ways unfair, there was a hangover, so to speak, from the prior iteration where they were not afforded a huge amount of deference, credibility. And I think there needs to be often, I mean, everyone on this call has this awareness, but I do think there is still a surprising lack of awareness, or if there's awareness, a lack of influence sometimes among the communications department of making leadership aware of these continued externalities and how they are likely to affect, the communication, even if it is improved from what happened in the past because of that, very sort of reputation hangover, which I think is more prominent now.
Yeah. Jeremy, you said something that sparked a thought here, is that around, the other profiles of Mark, right? In this case, right? Him buying new homes or him buying X, whatever, right? Him changing his look and feel, right? Now his Instagram is him, skiing behind a boat, right? So I think what we sometimes
Or
fail
at the
at.
UFC fight.
Oh, that one was my favorite actually. But I think sometimes as communicators, we do fail at one area, which is thinking about personas. Right? Marketers do a much better job of this because I do believe marketing and comms are different. And
Right.
marketers come to work every day and they think about personas. I think sometimes we forget that is just as important on the comm side, right? Like, what's the persona of Mark in this case? What is the persona we want Mark to be in this case? So whether it's perceived or not, persona and tone really play such a critical role in all of these things we're talking about here. Because in that case, journalists went back to his persona and they were like, wait, I'm going to also attach this video of him at the fight, right? In the midst of this.
Yeah, and I
I
think
agree.
one additional way to de-risk that for the CEO and for the company is just what I'll call the democratization of reputation. And just to simplify that is spreading reputation through the employee population, right? Because if we really want to know what went on at Meta, are we going to trust a quote from the CHRO, or are we going to trust our former coworker who works for Meta, who's telling us what's going on? So I think the more companies are passing the microphone to those next level C-suite leaders, and even more broadly to the workforce, the more they're going to have a strong reputation that can rebound from these moments. And I see a lot of, I think, Jennifer, you were a former Amazon, but I see a lot of Amazon campaigns doing this where they're really empowering some of the workers at the factory to carry the message of reputation and talk about what it looks like to work there, what they're empowered to do. I think that's a really good buffering strategy as well.
Yeah, I like it. I think, we talk a lot about the C-suite and expanding the bench, but the bench is outside of just the executive suite, right?
Mm-hmm.
C-suite, executive suite, and then in Amazon's case, right, you're getting into retail, right?
Right.
When I was at AT&T, that was also important. We had thousands of stores, right? So if corporate made a decision or a comment, it trickled down to the retail stores, and now we've empowered that store manager, who quite frankly is on the front line of thousands of employees, to become also a spokesperson. So, it's just complex. The bigger the organization, the more complexity it certainly brings out.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and there's, as a alumni of Amazon for a short time during the pandemic, I think that companies that have a very large and diverse workforce, not just diverse in the, socioeconomic, but regional, geographic, you know, um, proverbial white collar, blue collar split, tech split versus kind of brick and mortar, all the things, bringing those voices into the public discussion is crucial in a way that is seen as, real, authentic, on brand, not, a quasi hostage video, so to speak, right? and giving employees space, to both, communicate the opportunities that they've had at the company, but also sometimes, things even the company can do better, these outlets, right? And I think that also, is something that should be a consistent cadence well outside of a moment like a layoff, right? I mean, I think
Yeah.
I always tell clients that it's like, the analogy to asking a loan, going to the bank for a loan. Like the worst possible time that you can go to a bank for a loan is when you're in financial straits, right? You're
Exactly.
struggling, you're worried about missing payroll or making a mortgage payment, right? The better approach is to ask, for a line of credit when you just got a big bonus or you got a new job or you inherited a little bit of money, right? To have that relationship though with the banker where you see these people day in and day out. We talk about this in advocacy, on Capitol Hill. You're doing visits. We talk about this in media relations, as Dustin
Yep.
knows so well. Like you're checking in with your journalist friends without pitching them,
Yep.
right? And I think, it does provide kind of a belt and suspenders for an organization because there are going to be these moments of strain. There's going to be layoffs. There's going to be different changes in trade policy. Obviously,
Yeah.
Brad knows that well, working, in a company like General Motors, which has massive international supply chains, and one trade change on a tariff or something can have tens of billions of dollars of impacts, right? And so, I think having a leader that decides what they want to talk about on a day-to-day basis and then making these decisions about in these sort of reputation, high stakes reputation moments, is that leader brand, aligned to what this moment is? If yes, it works, it can work well. If no, then either they need to be adapted for that or we need to find somebody else who it's more sort of on their leadership brand.
Yep.
By the way, folks, we have about 20 minutes left, so please ask any questions. We have some good conversation going on. One thing Michelle Germano mentioned is doing a frontline audit to make sure that things are being communicated down the chain. What's interesting is there's a local Starbucks near where I live, like there is for everybody. And I don't go in there that often, but my wife and I got the rare date, got the babysitter for the 5 kids, headed out. Actually, we have so many kids, we had 2 babysitters. And so we scooted out and I commented and I said, how have you guys seen with fewer options at the store? That's allegedly what's been happening. And this poor employee said, we've got more options. It's actually overwhelming. It was really interesting to see that just as a communicator that allegedly Brian Nickel had said we're going to do fewer things, fewer products, focus more on our core customers. I, as the once a month customer, came in and this person said I've actually there've been more. So that was a really interesting, to your point, Jennifer, like data point for me about is that being communicated effectively or was just this one employee? I don't know, but that was a really interesting data point for me in light of what you just described.
Well, and that's a complex organization, right? It's
Right.
global, it's international, they're huge, there's stores everywhere. Um,
Mhm.
one side note, and I used to appreciate this about AT&T when I was there, is they had a rotation of leaders in their retail stores at all times. And it was required. And same thing with the communication staff. So I was working often in a retail store. So I could be there and our leaders could be there to hear on the front lines, like, am I
Mhm.
confused about voice versus data? How do I choose between one of the 50 phones? I don't understand this plan. Whatever the thing
Mhm.
was, it's just having that pulse of the customer, the front lines that we often don't get on the corporate side for those of us who've always been on the corporate side. But I think if you don't have that as built into your culture, our role as communicators is to how does that get seeded into our culture? And I think you've got to figure that out, right? And now there's just no excuse. We've got video at the wazoo, right?
Mhm.
That could be shown. We've got snippets and short takes that could be shown. We've got all hands meetings and what I used to also like to call some hands, right? Not all hands is everybody. And it's, at AT&T, it was 500,000 employees.
Oh,
Some hands is where, okay, let me go talk to the finance team, right? Or let me go talk to the whatever team, the retail team. And you had a more customized, focused approach. But it doesn't matter in the sense of any of those vehicles. We've got 1,000 different vehicles. As we think of our messaging and our messaging matrix, that Starbucks employee just didn't get it. Whether he or she chose not to receive it is one thing. But I'm kind of curious of, how were they seeding those messages, right? It's the old school flyer in the workroom approach, right? How am I getting to that area and that place of business?
A great point.
and Brad and Jeremy, we've all, and I can't speak, Jennifer, for your experience with politics, but Brad and Jeremy and I are regularly talking about such matters. And I wrote a piece recently about how government affairs and corporate comms need to be more tightly tied together and working together. Because to Jeremy's point earlier, it used to be, other than maybe some lobbying dollars and begging for a bailout, you didn't really need to have the CEO in DC unless they were being called in, like Toyota's CEO was. What a coincidence. The federal government owned two of their competitors and they called in Toyota's CEO for a few hundred brake issues. Now it is all the time. Brad, your boss at General Motors was the head of the business roundtable,
Yep.
and she was getting the stock kicked out of her a lot
Mm-hmm.
because she was accused of being, green energy and very liberal and trying to brown nose the Biden administration. And she was the head of the business roundtable. Of course, she was being involved in the political world. For me, I think a lot of times it's easy to forget as a communicator. We see a lot of hot takes on LinkedIn about how some companies should have reacted to American Eagle or Chick-fil-A or Costco 14 months ago about DEI. They had the vote. They just had to make a position. They put out a statement. I don't think they've talked about it since. They. So I'm very interested in even today when President Trump put out a Truth Social post and tank your stock, or Elon Musk stopped a House bill, a year ago, is how do we as communicators, apologies, someone on the team is calling me. I just need to let them know I'm not available. On Slack. So we started using Slack. We have British colleague now. So now we have another platform to learn. I'd be very curious as to how you advise CEOs in the C-suite more broadly to be aware of the political aspect. My general advice is shut your mouth at first, unless you absolutely must respond. That's my.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've done other panels on this. I think it intrinsically is tied into the company's mission, vision, values, and purpose, right? If something has been part of your brand, I mean, I always
Right.
think about like a Patagonia, right? Like intrinsic to Patagonia is environmental sustainability,
Right.
clean supply
Yes.
chains,
Right.
worker protections, right? I mean, and it makes sense for their leadership, to be, outspoken. It makes sense to their customer base. I mean, they know their customers super well, right?
Yep.
For other companies that have heritage in different topics and are comfortable talking about something, then great. I mean, I think where we see a lot of complaints both from the right and left come where companies are seen as like a weather vane, where depending on the political moment, they're like
Target
all
is
in
the
on
example you always
something.
use.
Yeah,
Yep.
they're all in on something that like they really weren't all in before it was like fashionable to do it, right? I mean, we saw this tragically after the George Floyd murder.
Right.
Companies were like, all about, DEI or other, right? And then, we see like when Trump came back to office, some of these same companies like running away and bad mouthing DEI, right? And I think those companies that reacted sort of, rashly were the ones that ended up looking the worst because they appeared to not stand for anything other than trying to just be with the political moment,
Yeah.
right? Whereas you've seen other companies, to their credit, they're being like, we're continuing in what has worked for us. and, let the chips fall where they may, right? I think, Target is a good example of a company that's gotten into some trouble. They tried to sort of be all things to all people at all times, and it became this mushy kind of mess that they've had to sort of clean up, right? Um,
Yep.
and so I think that should never be far away. I mean, I always tell clients in DC, obviously, like, we're at an era now where you're either at that table or you're on the menu, right? And so,
Yes.
being sort of engaged doesn't mean you speak up on everything, to your point, Dustin, but you certainly have to be aware of how everything you say and do is going to be, absorbed by the White House, by Congress,
Yep.
by an enforcement agency, even nowadays, by possibly a law enforcement agency, right? That's the reality of sort of our politics right now. And we can get into a different discussion one day about why that is and who's to blame. And, you know,
You and I could have that show by ourselves for I think about 24 hours.
Ben Sass, for anyone who,
Oh
watches
man.
60 Minutes, I think,
Oh, oh, Ben
besides
Sass.
the human tragedy, he had a lot of really good thoughts that were sort of getting into this. But I think the bigger question is the answer to your question, I think, and what I counsel my clients is that you cannot disconnect reputation, communication, and politics anymore, even if you try to, because oftentimes, too, silence communicates a lot, right?
Or people
Yeah.
will say it does,
Well,
even if it
so
doesn't.
silence is a comment. We used to say this a lot,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, but I think the three of you hopefully appreciate that now government affairs, government relations has more of a impactful seat at the table than it ever has,
Well,
right?
it needs
This
to.
conversation would have probably looked very different 10 years ago from a corporation's perspective, but now communicators are needing that level of experience, right? They need to have policy government affairs experience in their tool chest. Otherwise, they're going to have a really tough time helping their companies navigate these things when they happen.
I think we've seen the rise, as everyone's talked about in a lot of organizations, of that role of the chief corporate affairs officer or the chief external affairs officer that oversees, public affairs, government affairs,
Mhm.
CSR, a crisis, right? Rapid response media relations. And I think it's exactly to your point about that these skill sets can no longer be sort of siloed,
Yep.
bifurcated, separated, that they all touch on the organization's sort of reputation, perception, brand value, leadership, etc.
And real quick, I want to pivot to Brad because Brad, the last time you were, I think, on the show, you talked about a really good example of when President Trump visited Whirlpool when you were there and how you had to navigate what was a very normal trip. President visiting, I think you said like 8 presidents in a row had come to, I think, that location for that conversation, but you had to navigate it very differently for the exact reasons we're talking about. I'd love to see, have you kind of relive that for us for a minute or two.
Yeah. I mean, that was challenging. I think the company that I was working for at the time obviously thrived through that. I think we had like 50% neutral media, 25% positive, 25% negative, if I remember how it all shook out. But it's because we were committed to our US manufacturing workforce. And so we had hosted Biden administration officials, we had hosted Trump administration officials. It was a continuation of our ongoing narrative
Mhm.
and our ongoing business priorities to support the US manufacturing workforce. And so I think similarly with the other big company that I was with in the automotive industry, having an all electric future and going zero emissions, zero congestion, zero crashes, that is a strategy that will survive many different political views, different administrations. Like we should be working with the Biden administration the same as we're working with the Trump administration in order to achieve that end goal. So I think having those values, long-term values and long-term strategy help you manage through those different political climates.
Such an important statement
Yeah.
because the political moment of today will not necessarily be the political moment, at the next election, at the next
Right.
election for mayor, for a county executive that controls, permitting, to governor, to senators, to the presidency, to Congress, to everything, right? And so I think, you know, companies that, stand for these core values, leaders that stand for core values, even if they're a little weird or a little brash or a little bit whatever, right? I think those are the ones that, tend to, be successful over time, obviously delivering, financial results and performance, are the ones that are successful because there's a consistency, right? There's a consistency, there is a familiarity, and there is an authenticity that's much different than companies that are viewed as very reactive to, it's an easy trap to fall in because we don't. I mean, a lot of us have talked about this. This is not an original thought, but it's like the Walter Cronkite nightly news, right? Like the break, the Washington Post, New York Times, and Walter Cronkite, David Brinkley, right? That was a once a day, consumption. Our consumption is second by second. There are
Oh,
tens
yeah.
of millions, hundreds of millions of TikTok videos and Instagram posts and Twitter X posts, right? And news breaks, sometimes hundreds of times a day. And the people breaking the news are more often than not journalists, right? And so everyone is a breaking news journalist on what they define as news all the time. And you have, leaders making their own news, right? And all of that is something that up until the last 5 or 10 years was totally foreign, right? And I think as communicators, we have to be mindful that that's the universe that we live in. I mean, we even saw this recently about some leaders, using personal gripes, to make news or to make a statement. We saw, Bill Ackman, I think, who's, I don't agree with his politics, but I think he is one of the most skilled communicators
Super
using
skilled.
modern tools.
Yes.
And he did this like 6,000 word ex post about, a disgruntled employee that's suing him and what this means for, corporations and having to be forced into settlements. And like within 5 or 10 minutes, Elon Musk was responding. Donald Trump Jr. was responding. I mean,
Incredible.
that probably had more eyes that day than, Fox, CNN, and all three
Yeah.
nightly broadcasts, right? And I think when we think about these things, we have to think about that's how news is often made now.
It's the new norm.
It's a new norm. So I want to, we got a couple of minutes left. I want to end with a round robin here. I promised I would push back on something and I haven't done it yet, so I'm going to, which is I think that new norm, the fact that news is alleged and actual news is breaking all the time, does lend itself towards silence, not as a statement, to Jennifer's point earlier, but rather as trying to just not be so reactive to everything. And so I wonder sometimes if there's so much communication to the broader audiences, right? Like Meta, to go back to them again a year and a half ago, was heavily criticized for they did something that was tied to Trump becoming president. And that was supposed to, there was big headlines about it, big controversy. But at the end of the quarter, investors were super happy. In 2016, he was attacked for donating to a left of center get out the vote organization. He was also criticized because President Trump's digital team did an amazing job using the Facebook algorithm to actually help him gain votes. And he was criticized by both parties. Congress was going after him and everything. And as far as I can tell from I looked at the revenue numbers. They were doing $82 billion in 2020. How much of this breaking news by the second means that most of the time there needs to be a reminder from the communications team to the C-suite: focus on your core audience, focus on those who matter the most, whatever percentage of the time, as a general rule, while also planning, to Jennifer's point, for the likelihood of an actual crisis. Again, maybe I'm oversimplifying it because I've never worked in corporate, but that seems to be a general rule, and I'd love for everyone to react to that as we end here.
Well, I think that these days people forget that silence can be a strategy. But again, that's something you need to just get pre-alignment on, right? Levi's has a classic silent strategy sometimes. Apple had one,
Apple.
right? But I think you have to, yeah. And when I was at Apple, we used that strategy a lot, and it was effective. It may not be effective for other corporations. So you have to go back to getting alignment early and asking yourself, does this align with our culture? I think, Dustin, to your other question, which is, if and when a crisis happens, you have to kind of remind yourself you do have a golden hour, but you have to capitalize on the golden hour. Like, what does that first couple of hours look like? And who's going to say something, and what are they going to say, and to what platform are they going to use? Because if you miss that window, you've missed the window, right? And it's very hard to get the golden hour back. And so again, rather than spend an hour talking to your C-suite about should we talk, who talks, what's the messages, have that predefined, because we can all predict the 10 things that potentially can happen.
Yeah, and know that, detractors will fill the void, and that can sometimes, it's not always fatal, right? But you have to understand if you're going to take the silence route, being very, very cognizant of what voices will fill that silence.
That's right.
And are they allied voices? Are they detractors? Are they persuadables? Are they somewhere in between? How are we going to react? Sometimes, I think sometimes companies are very good about, they actually do respond, but they don't respond directly. They respond through sort of proxy allies, right?
That's right.
They respond through trade associations. They respond through business partners. Sometimes they respond through employees, right? And I think, to your point, really doing this planning, not every scenario. If you come up with Jennifer's top 10, I think you'll get like 95%, but usually, it's some flavor of those 10, right? And there's always room to make little nips and tucks, right?
Yes.
But I think the companies, it's always astonishing to me, even today, that sophisticated, large organizations seem to be completely caught off guard. And even ones that have great communications counsel, I think that oftentimes comes down to like, is that head of communications, is that head of corporate affairs, is that head of, whatever we call the top comms or public affairs person, are they in the right room? Are they, are they in the right room, and are they given the same type of influence that the CFO or the chief legal officer or, that similar C-suite voice is given? I think oftentimes what we've seen is, in the companies that really seem to flub it, they have that person, but the person isn't part of like the top, management, or they don't feel like they can actually speak up, right? And so they kind of are there, but they're not really there. You
Brad,
probably
you're good.
saw part of that too, Brad, in working at these super high levels, right?
Brad, you're on mute. Great way to end the show.
Sorry. Yeah, I've seen so much in different areas related to this, but the one thing that I've seen is that I believe authenticity will win at the end of the day. And it makes me think of a big communication plan that I worked on that had to go to the CEO, and it had to go to Elon Musk, and it had to go to the Biden administration. And the way that each of those unpacked the messaging, reviewed it, revised it, and processed it was wildly different. You had the Biden administration, which was very tactical, very like, who are the media outlets it's going to? How are we positioning it? You had the big company, which was like, we have to have 3 people look at this quote that you wrote for the CEO. And then you had Elon, who it didn't go to his communication team because there was no communication team.
There was none.
It went to his head of engineering, who reviewed it like factually, and then it went directly to Elon. And so, for better or worse, I feel like the tech industry is taking us into this space of radical authenticity and transparency really fast moving media hits where it's like they're going on podcasts and there's 10 things a day that could be a different story. And we have to be ready for all of that. We have to be ready for the radical authenticity. We have to be ready for the rapid fire of crises that could pop up. And it's just a whole new landscape that we need to be in and we need to be ready for, especially with AI and all of the AI created content. We just need to be ready for the change.
Radical and ready.
Yeah, radically authentic and ready for change. That's what I'm ending with.
Well, folks, this was great. I really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining us in the comments. Again, we spent the last hour discussing, is your CEO building the brand or creating a crisis? So Jennifer, Brad, Jeremy, really appreciate you all joining us again. Have a good rest of your day.
Hey, thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.